All right. Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different, maybe. And I'm really excited to get into it. We're going to be talking about the aesthetics of the everyday.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. And I think especially for people with philosophical backgrounds, it's sort of a natural extension of a lot of the things that we think about.
Yeah, that's right. I think that a lot of us who come from a background in philosophy, we are accustomed to thinking about aesthetics in terms of fine art. What is beauty? What is art? These sorts of questions. But what happens when we shift our attention away from the museum or the concert hall and we look at the everyday things around us?
Yeah.
I mean, can we have an aesthetic experience of, I don't know, doing the dishes?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the kind of question that everyday aesthetics is asking. And, we have this great resource today that we're going to be using from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's an entry on the aesthetics of the everyday. And it does a really good job, I think, of kind of laying out this whole field and some of the key debates.
Yeah, this entry is great. It's really comprehensive. And I think, our goal today is to kind of understand how we can apply this concept of aesthetics to the ordinary world around us, the everyday, but also, what are some of the challenges that this perspective poses to, more traditional theories of aesthetics?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, maybe we could start with that a little bit, thinking about the history of aesthetics, because actually the idea that we can only have an aesthetic experience of fine art is a fairly recent one.
Yeah, that's right. So, like in the 19th century, Western aesthetics really started to focus a lot on fine art. But the entry points out that the theory of the aesthetic attitude that was really popular at the time suggests that we can have an aesthetic experience of anything, literally anything.
Yeah, I mean, the theory says that if you take the right attitude towards something, if you look at it in the right way, then you can have an aesthetic experience of it. So, it doesn't have to be a painting or a piece of music. It could be a tree or a cloud or even a pile of garbage.
Right, right. So it almost seems like a kind of contradiction in a way, right? Like on the one hand, we had this very expansive theory that said anything can be an object of aesthetic experience. But on the other hand, aesthetics as a discipline really focused on fine art.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few possible explanations for that. And one, I think, is that, as aesthetics became more and more professionalized, as it became its own discipline within philosophy, there was a kind of pressure to, define its scope, to say, this is what aesthetics is about and this is what it's not about.
And, the entry also mentions that this renewed focus on everyday aesthetics that we're seeing today, it's not entirely new. It's not like something that we just invented out of thin air.
Yeah, I mean, everyday aesthetics is often seen as kind of a reaction to the more traditional or art-centered aesthetics of the 20th century. But the entry points out that actually everyday aesthetics has a much longer history, and especially if we look outside of the Western tradition.
Right. So, for example, a lot of non-Western cultures, they have a much more integrated approach to aesthetics. So you think about like Japanese culture, right? So aesthetics isn't just confined to like the tea ceremony or flower arranging. It's really infused in all aspects of life, like even the way that they prepare food or arrange their homes.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I mean, even in the West, if we go back far enough, we can see examples of philosophers who were interested in the aesthetics of the everyday. So, someone like I don't know, John Dewey, right? So he wrote a lot about the aesthetics of experience, and he was really interested in how we can have aesthetic experiences in all aspects of our lives, not just when we're engaging with art.
Right, right. Okay, so that gives us a bit of a historical context. So everyday aesthetics is really about kind of expanding our understanding of aesthetics.
Right.
It's about saying that, the aesthetic is not something that's just confined to art galleries and concert halls. It's something that we can find all around us if we're paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so then let's talk about the scope of everyday aesthetics. What are some of the things that fall under this umbrella? So we've already mentioned, like everyday objects and activities, but what else is there?
Well, the entry talks about things like our interactions with other people. So, the way that we talk to each other, the way that we move our bodies, the clothes that we wear, all of these things can be considered from an aesthetic point of view.
Okay, so social aesthetics would fall under the umbrella of everyday aesthetics.
Exactly. And then there's also the aesthetics of the environment. So, the places that we live in, the places that we work in, the natural world.
Right, right. So it's really quite a broad category. It's not just about whether we find a particular chair aesthetically pleasing or not. It's really about how we experience the world around us in all of its richness and complexity.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's also worth noting that everyday aesthetics isn't just about, the things that we typically think of as being beautiful.
Yeah, that's right.
So the entry talks about how we can also have aesthetic experiences of things that are, ugly or disgusting or even boring.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, right? Because it kind of challenges our, traditional idea of what aesthetics is all about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, when we start to look at the everyday world through this lens of aesthetics, we inevitably encounter some philosophical puzzles. What are some of the, key theoretical issues that everyday aesthetics raises?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big ones is the question of the aesthetic object. So, in traditional aesthetics, the aesthetic object is usually pretty clear cut. It's a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music. But in everyday aesthetics, the aesthetic object is much more difficult to define.
So, if I'm having an aesthetic experience of doing the dishes, what's the object of that experience? Is it the dishes themselves? Is it the act of doing the dishes? Is it the water? I mean, what is it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a tricky question. And, there's no easy answer. I mean, some people might say that, the object of the experience is the whole situation. The dishes, the water, the act of washing, the kitchen, the person doing the washing.
Right, right. It's kind of like
Right.
a gestalt.
Yeah.
It's more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, exactly. And then another issue is that, everyday objects are often designed for a specific
Mm.
purpose. A chair is designed to be sat on, a knife is designed to cut things. So, how do we separate out the aesthetic qualities of an object from its functional qualities?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, does a chair have to be comfortable in order to be aesthetically pleasing? Or can it be beautiful even if it's completely uncomfortable to sit on?
Yeah, that's another really tough question. And, I think there are a lot of different ways to approach it. Some people might say that, an object's function is actually part of its aesthetic qualities. The fact that a chair is designed to be sat on actually contributes to our experience of its beauty.
Right, right.
And then, another issue that comes up is the question of judgment. In traditional aesthetics, we often make judgments about art. We say that, this painting is beautiful or this sculpture is moving. But how do we make aesthetic judgments about everyday things?
Yeah, I mean, is there a right or wrong answer when it comes to, whether I find a particular lamp aesthetically pleasing or not?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And again, there's no easy answer. Some people might say that, aesthetic judgments are subjective, that it's all a matter of personal taste. But other people might say that, there are some objective standards of beauty, that some things really are more beautiful than others.
So it seems like everyday aesthetics really pushes us to think differently about, some of these fundamental questions in aesthetics, right? Like, what is an aesthetic object? What are the criteria for aesthetic judgment? These sorts of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's one of the really exciting things about this field. It's really challenging us to think in new ways about aesthetics.
Okay, so, we've been talking about this term everyday aesthetics,
Hmm.
but I think it's worth taking a step back and asking, what exactly do we mean by everyday?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's one that's been debated quite a bit within everyday aesthetics.
So, I mean, is it just the things that we do every day? I mean, is it like brushing our teeth, making coffee? I mean, is that all that it is, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, I mean, some people define every day in that really literal sense, as just the things that we do on a daily basis. But I think, a more interesting way to think about the everyday is as a kind of attitude that we take towards things.
So it's not so much about the frequency with which we do something, but it's more about the way that we experience it.
Yeah, exactly. So, the everyday is the realm of the familiar, the habitual, the taken for granted. It's the things that we don't really pay attention to because they're so much a part of our lives.
So like driving to work, right? I mean, most of us do that every day, but we don't really think about it as an aesthetic experience.
Yeah, exactly. But everyday aesthetics is about trying to kind of defamiliarize the everyday. It's about trying to get us to see the beauty and the wonder in the things that we normally take for granted.
Okay, so it's about kind of waking us up to the aesthetic possibilities that are all around us.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then what about aesthetics? I mean, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but what exactly are we talking about when we talk about aesthetics?
Yeah, so, I mean, the term aesthetics has a really long and complicated history. But I think, for our purposes today, we can think of it as being about the way that we experience the world through our senses.
So it's about How things look, how they sound, how they smell, how they feel, how they taste.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also about the feelings and the emotions that these sensory experiences evoke in us.
So, when I see a beautiful sunset, I might feel a sense of awe or wonder. Or when I hear a piece of music that I really love, I might feel joy or excitement.
Yeah, exactly. And so, everyday aesthetics is about saying that we can have these kinds of aesthetic experiences, not just with art, but with all sorts of things in our everyday lives.
Okay, so, one of the key ideas in everyday aesthetics is this notion of defamiliarization that you mentioned earlier. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so defamiliarization is this idea that, in order to see the aesthetic qualities of everyday things, we need to kind of shake ourselves out of our habitual ways of seeing the world.
So it's about kind of looking at things with fresh eyes.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you're used to just seeing your coffee mug as a functional object, a thing that you use to drink coffee, then you might not really notice its aesthetic qualities.
Like the way that the light reflects off the surface or the way that the handle feels in your hand.
Yeah, exactly. So defamiliarization is about trying to see those things, to see the beauty in the ordinary.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we defamiliarize ourselves?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to do that. One way is to just pay more attention to your surroundings, really look at the things that you normally just glance over.
So like the next time I'm walking down the street, I might actually stop and look at the cracks in the sidewalk or the way that the light is hitting the buildings.
Yeah, exactly. And, another way to defamiliarize yourself is to kind of change your routine. If you always take the same route to work, try taking a different route. If you always eat the same thing for breakfast, try something new.
So it's about kind of shaking things up a little bit, kind of disrupting our habitual ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, exactly. And, the entry also talks about how art can be a really powerful tool for defamiliarization.
Because art often presents us with new and unexpected ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you go to an art museum and you see a painting that...
Okay, so, defamiliarization is one way of engaging with the aesthetics of the everyday. But the entry also talks about this idea of the aesthetics of the ordinary. So what's the difference between these two approaches?
Yeah, so defamiliarization is about trying to make the ordinary seem strange or unfamiliar. But the aesthetics of the ordinary is about appreciating the ordinary for what it is.
So it's about finding beauty in the mundane, in the everyday things that we often take for granted.
Yeah, exactly. So, think about the feeling of coming home after a long day. It's a really simple, ordinary experience, but it can also be a really beautiful one.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of comfort and familiarity in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the aesthetics of the ordinary is about appreciating those kinds of experiences, the experiences that are so much a part of our lives that we often don't even notice them.
Okay, so, we've been talking about the aesthetics of the everyday in kind of a general sense, but I think it's worth getting into some of the specifics. So let's talk about some of the particular aesthetic qualities that we might find in everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the entry talks about a whole range of different qualities, things like neatness, messiness, cuteness, gaudiness, tastefulness.
Yeah, those are all interesting. And, it's kind of funny to think about those as aesthetic qualities, right? Because we don't normally think of them in that way.
Yeah, we tend to think of aesthetics as being about beauty and the sublime. But everyday aesthetics is about saying that those aren't the only aesthetic qualities.
Right.
We can have aesthetic experiences of all sorts of things, even things that we might not find traditionally beautiful.
Okay, so let's take one of those as an example. Let's talk about messiness. So, can messiness be an aesthetic quality?
Yeah, I think it definitely can. Think about a really messy desk.
Like mine.
Well, maybe not yours, but, a really messy desk, like the kind that you see in movies sometimes, where there are papers and books and coffee cups and all sorts of other stuff just piled up everywhere.
Right, right.
Some people might find that really aesthetically pleasing. They might find it to be kind of chaotic and energetic and even kind of beautiful in its own way.
So it's like a kind of anti-beauty in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about messiness as an aesthetic quality. It's kind of transgressive. It
Right.
kind of goes against our normal expectations of what's aesthetically pleasing.
Right, right.
And, it can also be kind of personal, Like a messy desk can be a reflection of the person who uses it.
Yeah, that's true.
It can be a kind of expression of their personality or their way of working.
Okay, so messiness is one example.
Yeah.
What are some other aesthetic qualities that we might find in everyday life?
Yeah, so the entry talks about cuteness as another example. And, cuteness is interesting because it's often seen as being a kind of low-level aesthetic quality. It's
Mm,
something that we associate with babies and animals and, things that are kind of small and harmless.
right, right.
But, some people have argued that cuteness is actually a really important aesthetic quality. It's something that can evoke feelings of joy and affection and even a kind of protectiveness.
So it's not just about, finding something visually appealing. It's also about the emotional response that it evokes in us.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that's true of a lot of the aesthetic qualities that we find in everyday life. They're not just about how things look, they're also about how they make us feel.
Okay, so, we've been talking about these different aesthetic qualities, but I think it's worth taking a step back and asking, what are some of the philosophical implications of everyday aesthetics? Why does this matter?
Yeah, so I think one of the big implications is that it really challenges our traditional idea of aesthetics as being about, beauty and the sublime.
Hmm.
Everyday aesthetics is about saying that those aren't the only aesthetic qualities.
Right, right.
We can have aesthetic experiences of all sorts of things, even things that we might not find traditionally beautiful. And, I think that's really important because it opens up the possibility of aesthetic experience to everyone. You don't have to be an art expert or a philosopher to have an aesthetic experience.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, it's kind of democratizing aesthetics in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And, another implication is that it really highlights the importance of the everyday. We often think of the everyday as being kind of mundane and boring. But everyday aesthetics is about saying that the everyday is actually full of beauty and wonder if we're just willing to look for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, the idea that the best things in life are free. You don't have to spend a lot of money to have an aesthetic experience. You can just step outside your door and look around.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that's one of the really great things about everyday aesthetics. It's really about kind of slowing down and appreciating the simple things in life.
Okay, so, we've been talking about this idea of everyday aesthetics, but I think it's worth asking, what are some of the challenges that this perspective poses to more traditional theories of aesthetics?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is that everyday aesthetics really blurs the boundaries between art and life. In traditional aesthetics, we tend to think of art as being something that's separate from everyday life. But everyday aesthetics is about saying that actually art can be found all around us in the most ordinary of things.
So, the way that I arrange the furniture in my living room or the way that I dress myself, those can be considered as forms of art.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that can be a really challenging idea for some people because it kind of undermines the traditional hierarchies of value that we
Yeah.
have in aesthetics. If a pile of laundry can be art, then what does that say about, the Mona Lisa?
Right, right.
I think everyday aesthetics is really forcing us to rethink our assumptions about what art is and what it's not.
Okay, so, everyday aesthetics is challenging us to think differently about art, but it's also challenging us to think differently about the nature of aesthetic experience itself.
Yeah, that's right. In traditional aesthetics, we tend to think of the aesthetic experience as being something that's passive. We go to an art museum, we stand in front of a painting, and we just kind of take it all in.
Right, right.
But everyday aesthetics is about saying that aesthetic experience can also be active. It can be something that we create ourselves through our interactions with the world around us.
So, like when I'm cooking a meal, I'm not just passively consuming something, I'm actually actively creating an aesthetic experience.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that's one of the really exciting things about everyday aesthetics. It's really about kind of empowering us to create our own aesthetic experiences.
Right, right.
We don't have to rely on artists or museums to provide us with aesthetic experiences. We can create them ourselves in our everyday lives.
Okay, so, we've been talking about everyday aesthetics in kind of a general sense, but I think it's worth talking about some of the specific areas of research within this field. So, what are some of the things that people are working on?
Yeah, so one area of research is the aesthetics of food.
Right, that makes sense.
There's a growing interest in how we experience food aesthetically, not just in terms of taste, but also in terms of, presentation and atmosphere and all of that.
Right, right. So it's not just about whether the food tastes good. It's also about how it looks, how it smells, how it's served. the environment in which you're eating it.
Yeah, exactly. And then another area of research is the aesthetics of the home. So how do we make our homes aesthetically pleasing, right?
What are the different factors that contribute to a sense of beauty or comfort in our homes?
Right, right.
And then another area of research is the aesthetics of technology.
Mhm.
So, how do we experience technology aesthetically?
Right,
Are there certain design principles that make technology more aesthetically pleasing?
right, right. I mean, think about like Apple products, right? So they're often praised for their aesthetics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And then, there's also a lot of research being done on the aesthetics of everyday life in different cultures.
right, right. Because, different cultures have different aesthetic values.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, everyday aesthetics is a really rich and diverse field. There's just so much to explore. Okay, so, we've covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we've talked about the history of everyday aesthetics. We've talked about the scope of the field. We've talked about some of the key theoretical issues. We've talked about some of the specific areas of research. So to kind of wrap things up, I think it would be good to talk about, what are some of the key takeaways from our discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the key takeaways is that aesthetics is not just about art. We can have aesthetic experiences in all aspects of our lives, even the most ordinary of things.
Right, right. It's about kind of opening our eyes to the beauty that's all around us.
Yeah, exactly. And, another key takeaway is that aesthetic experience is not just passive, it can also be active.
Right, right.
We can create our own aesthetic experiences through our interactions with the world around us.
Okay. And then I think another key takeaway is that everyday aesthetics really challenges us to think differently about some of the fundamental questions in aesthetics.
Yeah, that's right. Questions like, what is an aesthetic object? What are the criteria for aesthetic judgment? These are questions that have been debated for centuries, but everyday aesthetics is really forcing us to look at them in a new light.
Okay, so I think, for our listeners, a good question to kind of leave them with is, what is one thing that you do every day that you can try to experience aesthetically?
Yeah, I mean, it could be anything, right? It could be brushing your teeth. It could be making coffee. It could be walking the dog. Just try to pay attention to the sensory experience, the way that it makes you feel, and see if you can find any beauty in it.
Right, right.
I think you might be surprised at what you discover.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great.